Have you and a group of people had one person you all hated? It didn't matter if you and that group of people got along, there was one person that all of you couldn't stand. There was one person in hockey who clashed with the other owners. And believe it or not, hockey owners being petty to him is what caused the creation of the National Hockey League. Who was that person? Eddie Livingstone. Play the intro. Eddie Livingstone, also known as Livvy, grew up in wealth. One of his interests was hockey. He played for the St. George's Club and later became a ref in the Ontario Hockey Association. Livingstone also reported on hockey games, even those he called. There might be some bias in those reports, but what do I know? With this passion for hockey and money, which I'm going to guess came from family wealth, refereeing, and reporting, Eddie Livingstone decided to buy the struggling team called the Toronto Ontarios. You heard that correctly, the Toronto Ontarios. Very creative name. Hockey's version of the Phillies. Anyway, just after the season began, the Ontarios swapped their orange sweaters, yes, sweaters, this was the early 1900s, for green sweaters, and renamed them to the Toronto Shamrocks. That's a better name. The first conflict began when the Toronto Shamrocks forfeited a game against the Montreal Wanderers, the English team in Montreal. Two Toronto players couldn't attend the game. At the time, the amount of players on a hockey roster could be counted on two hands. Remember, this is the 1914-15 season for the National Hockey Association. Wanderers owner Sam Lichtenhein said they would make up the game at a later date. However, Lichtenhein, realizing the 2 points could help the Wanderers win the league title, changed his mind and decided not to make up the game. Enraged, Livingstone demanded that he make up the game. Lichtenhein wanted Livingstone gone just because. NHL executives denied Sam's request for Livvy to be booted out and listed the game as a forfeit, which led to the Wanderers having to pay the Shamrocks $300, which the Wanderers had saved due to not traveling from Montreal to Toronto by train. The next season, the Toronto Blue Shirts, the other Toronto team in the National Hockey Association, were sold to Livingstone. However, NHA owners didn't want Livvy owning two teams in the same league. The Pacific Coast Hockey Association, a rival league on the West Coast, had been taking players from the Shamrocks and Blue Shirts. So Livvy took the remaining Shamrocks and put them into the Blue Shirts. The Shamrocks were an inactive franchise. It wasn't just that Livingstone didn't get along with NHA owners, he also fought with Toronto as well. Also before the 1915-16 season, Livingstone argued with the owners of Arena Gardens, the home of the Shamrocks and Blue Shirts, over rent. Livvy, trying to get his way, threatened to move the Blue Shirts to Boston. Keep in mind, the NHA was only made up of 6 teams at the time: the Montreal Wanderers, Montreal Canadiens, Quebec Bulldogs, Ottawa Senators, Toronto Blue Shirts, and the Toronto Shamrocks. There weren't any NHA teams in the United States. The NHA had no plans of American expansion and said they would not allow the move. But the NHA wanted a second team in Toronto, so to replace the Shamrocks was the 228th Battalion. You heard that correctly. A group of players who signed up for military service formed a hockey team, and they wore khakis while playing. For those who are confused, here's a recap. Livingstone bought the Toronto Ontarios, renamed them to the Shamrocks, bought the Toronto Blue Shirts, the other NHA team in Toronto, was forced to sell one of the two, which he didn't. He then transferred Shamrocks players to the Blue Shirts, and the NHA replaced the Shamrocks with the 228th Battalion. Make sense now? Anyway, Livingstone thought it was a dumb idea, but the battalion was doing well, being the most popular in terms of attendance. But then in February of 1917, the battalion was called into duty. Why? Well, it's 1917 and there's a war going on and more soldiers are needed, because once again, hockey rosters are narrow and the talent pool is being eaten by conscription and the draft. A few days later, the other NHA owners had a meeting, without Livingstone, on what to do with the battalion being basically shut down for the rest of the year. Their idea? Suspend the Toronto Blue Shirts. Bold idea. Now, at one point before the season, Sam Lichtenhein, owner of the Wanderers, offered Eddie Livingstone $3,000 to basically F off. Livvy countered by offering Lichtenhein $5,000 to do the same. Neither deal was accepted. Anyway, the media in Toronto was okay with the Blue Shirts being suspended only because it meant no Livingstone. Then in November of 1917, the NHA met, without Livingstone, at the Windsor Hotel in Montreal. The other owners all agreed they had to get rid of Livingstone. They couldn't vote him out of the league, but they could leave the NHA and start their own league without him, the National Hockey League. Does the NHL stand for not having Livingstone? You decide. The teams in this league were both Montreal teams, Ottawa, Quebec, in a few years, and Toronto. But how did Toronto get a team back? Livingstone wasn't the owner, so who was? The Arena Company, which owned Arena Gardens, was awarded the Toronto franchise. Basically, the Arena owned the team. They weren't technically known as the Arenas, but the Blue Shirts. All players were transferred from the NHA to the NHL. Despite this, Livingstone wasn't amused and tried to file an injunction against the other owners, but it didn't work. I should also mention that Livingstone loved to sue anyone or anything that looked at him funny, which was usually the other NHA/NHL owners, mainly Lichtenheim. Even with Livvy out of the league, the NHA had a bumpy beginning. Remember the Wanderers, the team owned by Lichtenheim? Well, only 6 games into the season, their arena burnt to the ground. I'm not kidding. The arena burnt down, causing the Wanderers to fold and the Canadiens to move to a nearby arena. Who or what caused the fire? Was it Livingstone? No. The fire started in the ice-making plant. As for the Toronto Blue Shirts, they won the Stanley Cup in their first season. Ironic. However, the celebration wasn't without controversy. Livingstone sued the arena. That eventually was settled, but even with the NHL existing without Livingstone, the NHL wasn't done with him. Either due to petty revenge or a grudge, the NHL did everything to ruin Livvy's life. In 1920, Livingstone had plans to start a rival league called the Canadian Hockey Association, based in Hamilton, Ontario. The NHL caught wind of it, and in order to block the formation, they moved the Quebec Bulldogs to Hamilton, creating the Tigers. When that didn't work, Eddie tried to create a league with teams in places like Boston, Detroit, Chicago, and New York. Do those cities sound familiar? The 4 American Original Six teams: the Boston Bruins, Detroit Red Wings, Chicago Black Hawks, and New York Rangers. New York also had the Americans, but they don't exist. Livingstone gave up trying to start a rival league and went back to owning a team. In 1926, Livingstone formed the Chicago Cardinals, not those Cardinals, of the American Hockey Association. A year later, he decided to sell the Cardinals, but the AHA rejected the sale. Despite this, Livvy, in his wisdom, thought the new owner would pay the rent at Chicago Coliseum. The Coliseum wasn't amused and refused to give the Cardinals ice time. Meanwhile, the AHA and NHL were discussing a partnership. The NHL was interested on one condition: no Livingstone. So the AHA terminated his membership. The players were dispersed across the league and the remaining players were transferred to the Blackhawks. Livvy said he would sell the Cardinals. One problem: he didn't have a team to sell without any players. So in response, he sued Blackhawks owner Frederick McLaughlin and a few AHA executives and won money. If you noticed by now, the NHL was fine with giving him money if it meant he would stay away from hockey. As for the Cardinals, they would be transferred to Kansas City a year later. No, I didn't say that just to shoehorn Kansas City into this video. You shut up. Livingstone gave up owning a professional team and went to coaching amateur teams. In 1929, he became the head coach of the Toronto Victorias, once again very creative name, of the Ontario Hockey Association. He would rename them to the Lions. Everything seemed fine now, except it wasn't. In November of 1933, the OHA said that 3 players on the Lions should be playing high school hockey instead of amateur hockey. Livingstone argued by saying it was directed at him. Was the NHL involved with this one? Probably not. On September 11th, 1945, Eddie Livingstone passed away, the day before his 61st birthday, leaving behind a complicated legacy in the sport of hockey. As for the arenas, they dealt with financial trouble dealing with Livingstone. The arenas would rename themselves to the St. Pats. The St. Pats would win the Stanley Cup in 1922, but would deal with more financial pain and were on the verge of being sold and relocated to Philadelphia. But instead, a group of investors led by Toronto Varsity Blues head coach and former Canadian Army officer Conn Smythe would buy the team, keeping them in Toronto. Smythe stated that civic pride was more important than money. One of his first moves was renaming the team to the Maple Leafs, as a tribute to his experiences as a World War I Army officer and a symbol of Canada. I won't go over everything that has happened with the Maple Leafs, but they would have another polarizing owner. One that was worse than Livvy. But that's a topic for another day. Without Eddie Livingstone, we wouldn't have the NHL. We would have the NHA. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Today's shoutout goes to Matt Spangler. I'll see you in the next video.